I'm really excited to be here. I've looked at some of the work that SCORAI has done with the Colloquium, the speakers, and I think it's just a marvelous conversation, and I'm really delighted to be part of it. So, as Jeffrey told you, I'm a sociocultural anthropologist. And over about half of my career, maybe the last 15, 20 years, I've been studying local activism, grassroots activism, social movements, most of it in the United States, but some in Nepal. So what I'll do in this talk is I'll draw some examples from some work that colleagues and I did in the late 90s in 2 different parts of the country on local environmental groups. And then lately, with other colleagues, I've been studying the local food movement in North Carolina, and I'll pay more attention to that. So my mandate from Helena, as with all the other speakers, was to talk about my theory of social change and then talk about how it might be relevant to thinking about transition to a post-consumerist society. So I've got a number of sections here, and I'll try to keep you apprised as to where I am. And hopefully you'll see how they all fit together as we go along. So I'm going to start out with this idea of disclosing new worlds. So in talking about my approach to social change, I think of it as foregrounding, emergence, disclosure, and cultivation. So this book by the feminist economic geographer collective of Gibson Graham is a really good, it provides a good orientation to this approach. So it advocates, again, as I say, foregrounding possibility, foregrounding emergence, diversity and cultivation at the grassroots level, at the everyday level. Instead of getting sort of mired in worrying about the structures, worrying about how they need to be disrupted, how there needs to be substitution of a new political economy or a new ontology. So you could think, well, you know, people who are into this emergence theory, if you want to call it that, maybe what it is that they're just overwhelmed by the odds against making positive change, but they can't bear to give up and quit fighting. So they take on this emergence view. But I will say that this view also fits my theoretical framework, which is I'm a practice theorist. And so I see diversity, I see flux, I see people putting together combinations of cultural resources in novel ways to respond to the kind of structures and systems that they're entangled in. And in particular, I'm a social practice theorist. And what that means for me, or what that means in the line of social practice theory that I do, is that we care about the constitution of the actor in practice and the possibility of agency. Okay, so back to this book. Probably a number of you have read it, and so you'll be hearing some repetition since you've heard it, but the idea, I mean, they build on the post-structuralist theme of the power of discourse, is what they do. And they start from the premise that powerful discourses about capitalism blind people, scholars included, to recognizing the non-capitalist kinds of practices, activities, subjectivities that exist and can potentially be built upon for you know, a more non-capitalist kinds of arrangements. So the book urges us to go beyond the usual capitalist-centric representations of the economy that lead to myopia, and instead pay attention to the alternative non-capitalist practices and so forth that lie hidden beneath or below what's usually represented. So as you see, as they're suggesting, what lies below are these practices and subjectivities that we should consider supporting and helping to develop. So what this book does is they in their areas where they lived, worked with communities that were undergoing severe economic dislocation, and they tried to bring these ideas that I've just talked about to those communities. They tried to reconstitute themselves as scholars and those that they were helping to try to see, value, and build upon these alternative kinds of sentiments and subjectivities to act their way into a community economy based more on non-capitalist principles. And of course, several of your speakers already have talked about alternative things, such practices. I think about Juliet Shore talking about sharing economy, for example. I mean, she's focusing on something that's non-capitalist. Eric Olin Wright talks about interstitial change and looking for something that fits into what might realize some non-capitalist principles that could move into a more massive change. So I want you, as we go along, to be thinking about what a post-consumerist politics might look like. So let me go back to the idea of disclosing new worlds that was in the title of this section. So another interesting book that builds or presents this kind of emergence theory of change is a book by a high-level business executive, a former cabinet minister, and a philosopher. So Spinoza et al. Argue in effect that change is uneven, such that there's often contradictions that exist between existing practices and certitudes and new structures of sentiment that are emerging. So the idea is that people sense these discomforts, they sense these contradictions, but they're not articulated as yet, and they're kind of ill-defined, and they're unrequited. So their idea is that activists are responding to these discomforts and so forth. And what they're trying, they sense them, they try to act on them to bring about change. And one thing that's interesting about them is they say, okay, well, in the US society and others like it, there's two main channels, or a couple of main channels of change. There's the civil society, that activists who act in that channel, work for NGOs or organized groups and try to affect policies and laws, or they try to create new activities and practices. And then there's another channel, which is the market. And so the people active in that area undertake entrepreneurial activities to try to create goods and services that would help to support new ways of living. So that's what these activists are disclosing, new worlds. That is, they're naming these worlds and they're helping to materialize them and build on these existing unfulfilled sentiments. So I noticed what I think of as an intriguing example of a Japanese consultant and book author, who's responding to the discontent that a lot of people feel about the clutter in their houses. And so if you've seen this book, Marie Kondo has written this book that's all about how to get rid of the clutter in your house. And it's actually, I'm enjoying it, let's put it that way. So this book, so the idea of it is that you go about decluttering your household by getting rid of everything in your house that fails to spark joy. So you have to realize what is important, sparks joy for you. And so in effect, to me, she seems to be trying to help us or teach us a form of ethical self-cultivation in which you become aware of who you are, and that's how you act, and you don't go out and buy stuff that has nothing to do with who you are or what sparks joy in your life. So I think Spinoza et al. Would treat her as an agent of change who may be disclosing a new world in which one values living parsimoniously, buying less, and is content. Okay, so I'll move on to this next section, the complex cultural assemblages and communities of practice. Some 15, 20 years ago, in this field of social movement studies underwent what is called the cultural turn. And they began to pay more attention to meaning and its importance in social movements. And I'm thinking of things like frames. There are a lot more emphasis on concepts like frames, collective identities. And so recently, anthropologists have gotten more involved with contributing to social movements. And I think one of the contributions that anthropologists are making concerns what I'm calling these complex cultural assemblages. So if you've read Bourdieu's Outline of a Theory of Practice, you know one of those complex cultural assemblages, which is the Kabyle game of honor. That's a complex cultural assemblage. So I've written out a definition here for you. So these assemblages so complex cultural assemblages performed by communities of practice are what they are: collectively bundled or orchestrated acts, activities, events, actors, and motives, interpreted against a horizon of meaning. So my co-authors and I we were inspired by Bourdieu's focus on this cultural game, and we developed the concept of figured worlds to talk about complex cultural assemblages. So if this is what this book, a lot of it is about figured worlds. So what figured worlds are, here's another long definition, are materialized imaginaries, and they're populated by sets of agents. This has an example from the world of romance and attractiveness, which I did research on in the late 70s. So anyway, so this figured world of attractiveness and romance was populated by a set of agents in this period, in this research: attractive women, boyfriends, lovers, fiancés, nerds, honks, jerks. There's a lot of names for characters who engage in a limited range of meaningful acts or changes of state: flirting with, falling in love with, dumping, having sex with, as moved by a specific set of forces like attractiveness, lust, love, with motives of gaining intimacy and prestige. Frames, as David Snow talked about, he talked about frames, and what I would say is that these are often sort of parts or a component of these larger cultural activities. Another anthropologist who's done work on these things is Sherry Ortner, and she talks about her name for these things, or she calls them serious games. Capitalism would be an example of that, or cultural games. And she says about them, she says, these activities bring into focus complex forms of social relations, especially relations of power, and complex dimensions of the subjectivity of social actors, especially those involving intentionality and agency. Okay, so I want to apply this idea to the creation of new worlds. But first, I think it's important, I can point out that these complex cultural assemblages, I think, are clearly important also in understanding impediments to change. So in the case of consumption practices, for example, I would wager a lot of money that a significant amount of consumption practices are subordinated to these cultural worlds, or to these larger cultural assemblages. In other words, their meaning, the meaning of those practices comes to some degree from this encompassing cultural world. So, in other words, the meaning would be, what it would mean would depend on the importance of the cultural world that's most significant to the person. So, for example, to the extent that the cultural world of academic anthropology is the most salient of my worlds, for example, the meaning of flying to Boston or flying around to lots of conferences is going to be very different than if the most significant of my cultural worlds is the world of environmental action. Okay. So moving on to how these cultural assemblages are important in creating new worlds. Now, if you got a chance to read the article that was posted, you learned about the creation of the cultural world of environmental justice. The article was called Becoming an Environmental Justice Activist. It's a chapter, not an article. So in the late 1970s and early 1980s, a story that you probably also know is activist communities in Warren County, North Carolina, disclosed a new world, the world of a particular type of environmental action called environmental justice. So some of the communities that did this constituted themselves as actors. They did things and had collective identities and did things. And so for one thing they did was these PCB protests that you see commemorated here in Warren County. So this is a class that I took to Warren County to learn about the environmental justice movement. So in any event, going back to these communities, these activist communities in Warren County, they were important in two different ways. One way was that they were, and they continue to be to a certain extent, productive collective actors who spread the idea of environmental justice far beyond the environmental justice communities that they were involved in. They fought to make environmental racism a meaningful and legible problem that the federal government recognized, for example. And they've marshaled a lot of forces to help other communities face environmental injustice. So that was one big bundle of things that they did. Another was that they created a context in which additional people came to develop a sense of themselves as environmental justice activists. So, and became capable of sustained action along those lines, the lines of environmental justice. So the more general point here that I'm making is that that these assemblages and the communities of practice which create them, they're sources of cultural production, for one thing. This flag, for example, is an example of a cultural production that came out of an activist group. They are sources of not only cultural production, but cultural politics, collective action, and new identities. So in other words, these activities that they're doing do a lot of the work of disclosing new worlds. Okay, so moving on to identities. So this section builds on the previous one. It focuses on the subjectivity of social actors who participate in these cultural worlds, cultural games. And some of us, you've already seen the cover of this book. We've written a lot about this process in this book, which there's a lot of in there that I obviously can't talk about, but I hope that by reading the chapter on becoming an environmental EJ activist, that you got some sense of what it's like to become politically engaged and to become a participant in politically engaged action as shaped in the world of, cultural world of environmental justice. So if you read this book or some of the other work that's been done on this, and you get the notion of identity in this work is built on the school of symbolic interactionist George Herbert Mead and so forth, but it's modified for, I think it's anthropologically modified, is what I would say, because it tries to bring culture in more clearly. And so it builds on ideas from Vygotsky, Bakhtin, and Bourdieu. And so I'm going to summarize some of the points here about these identities. Okay, so the idea is that intimate identities are traces of subjective experiences that are orchestrated kind of around with cultural resources, in particular arenas where you're self-invested, or self-invested, or your arenas of self-regard. So intimate identities are senses of self to which one is emotionally attached. You care about whether you're living up to your claims in those areas. So the idea is that there's, you have so we're just walking bundles of all memories, ideas, thoughts, snippets of conversation, sentiments, emotions, and in the case of an identity, these things get orchestrated into a kind of a bundle associated with cultural resources like a name of a type of activist. Or it could be a narrative or a self-story that's important in that world. Alcoholics Anonymous is a great example, the narrative that people learn to interact in that world, organizes a lot of that subjective material in there. So in our study, for example, of the environmental groups, were things like Someone Who Cares About the Earth, Radical Environmentalist. These were names that were really important, that people used to kind of orchestrate themselves to be environmentalists. So jumping to the fourth point here, these identities are important because they supply motivational force, as well as these other reasons. And this comes from the symbolic interactionist theory, which sort of says that people care about validating these identities. you kind of need to get reflection from your action and how it's received and how you view it to validate these identities from your performances of them. So a person who sees herself as a radical environmentalist is attracted to context where she can act on that identity. So then another point, this last one is, and this is really important, to the extent that you can voluntarily orchestrate yourself that way, this provides you with a platform for sustained action and agency. And you can understand this more if you think about Vygotsky. He was really interested in how do humans escape the tyranny of environmental stimuli. So if we kind of, everything we bump into, we react to, and that affects us, you're just kind of careening around whatever you bump into, and you can't keep focused and engaged in sustained action. So he considered cultural means as one of the ways that we learn to modulate our behavior. This is a very modest form of agency, but I think it's a really important one, and it's one that we use all the time. So cultural resources, you learn them, and you learn kind of how to use them to try to mediate your behavior. So that means that identity resources are culturally given, they're collectively created, and a social practice theory would argue that the key to self-discipline and to this modest form of agency is through these cultural resources. Now, as you can see, or you probably realize, these complex cultural assemblages that I've talked about, performed by community of practice, are a context in which you develop these intimate identities as an environmental justice activist, or say a radical environmentalist. And so discipline yourself to move against the kind of grain, to act into a new world. Okay, so now I'm going to switch to back to the theory of change that I laid out in the beginning of the talk, and think about how it might be applied more clearly to a transition to a post-consumerist society. So, if we pursue a politics of possibility, as Gibbs and Graham suggests, we would look around for what are the pro or proto-sustainable consumption kind of sentiments and practices that are out there already. Or following Spinoza et al., we would look for the array of possible worlds that are being disclosed and ask, well, are any of them going in a positive direction toward lessening consumption? So, to give you a taste of what I'll talk about, following my discussion of these complex cultural assemblages, communities of practice, I hope you're also convinced that there are good theoretical reasons for attending to and supporting some of these complexes. I've got a slide here that talks about why I think they're important to support, and I'll skip over them for right now, but we can come back to this slide if you want to talk about it more. Okay, so if you agree with me so far, you can probably, or understand what I'm saying, you can probably see the value of asking what's the potential of the local food movement for contributing to the emergence of a post-consumerist society. So I recently joined up with one of our graduate students, Diana Corral Gomez, a scholar she's a scholar, activist of movements, a couple of different movements in Colombia. And so she and I teamed up to think about, well, how can you assess the significance of activist efforts for furthering social and economic transformation? So here, we read an article about this, and you can see the title of it. And so Diana and I were drawn to the Gibson Graham book because of its post-capitalist politics, and because it joins together, it's very good, it joined together political economy, this kind of macro structures, together with an attention to micro-politics and subjectivities of everyday life. So we treated the book as a source of criteria for assessing whether or not a movement is bringing about significant change toward a more positive society. So Diana, her part of the chapter, the article, is about the feminist movement in Bogota in the 70s and 80s. What I did was to take the criteria and apply them to apply them to the local food movement in North Carolina circa 2010, 2011, when we were doing the research. So just to give you a teeny glimpse of that research, we had funding from NSF, and we were able to place ethnographers in 4 different places in North Carolina for a year's worth of ethnographic research. So that was the study. So let me show you, I'll talk about the positive features of the local food movement to start out with. So here are the criteria that we came up with, and I've highlighted the ones that the local food movement seems to meet, or local food activism seems to meet. So a nutshell description of the local food movement in North Carolina is that it has channeled an incredible amount of volunteer, that's important, volunteer energy, labor, creativity into rebuilding local food systems. And they have done a tremendous amount. They've even changed some of the material structures, things like building new meat processing plants. But they've also done a lot of things like cultivating taste for local food, introducing kinds of cultural activities that a lot more people know about, like CSAs, community service, agriculture activities, circulating discourses that promote a non-capitalist horizon of meaning for judging food systems, like environmental sustainability, denser community relations. And so it meets some of these Gibson Graham criteria. Politics of possibility was, palpable there, and is. So there's every sense expressed through discourses and actions and all sorts of experimental efforts that better food could be produced in better ways, new relations could be built around food to strengthen community, and that local efforts could make these new worlds possible. The movement certainly has an alternative vision that it's created. You could lessen dependency on the global food system. You could escape some of the vulnerability to its harms. You could revivify community relations. So local systems could not only produce better tasting food, but also lessen environmental damage and build community relations. So jumping to number 6, cultivation of subjects with desires and capabilities for sociability, happiness, and action offered by alternative economic arrangements. And I think perhaps the most exciting aspect of the local food movement is this kind of experimentation that's going on. And there's experimentation like about how one should relate to the local, to the food production system, to food producers differently, like CSAs, to labor, to agricultural labor. There's something called the crop mob, which started in Durham. And even to things like food consumption. If you know about the slow food movement, that's an experiment in changing the relationship. But the local food movement doesn't meet all the criteria. And for those who are used to social movements being oppositional to the state, oppositional to corporations, something along this line, the local food movement is disappointing. And it's interesting, the activists are often critical, in interviews, are critical as individuals of the global agro-food industry, but they didn't make that part of the collective effort. They didn't talk about it. It wasn't put into a public voice. All these critical comments that could be made about how the global food system is limiting the local food systems, that's just not part of the collective discussion. I ran into, or I heard a man who's the director of one of the national food organizations. It's headquartered in North Carolina. He was at a book reading I was at, and he referred to it as the happy food movement. He was clearly, disgruntled because they weren't more oppositional. Eric Olin Wright might call this escapism. Okay, and then jumping to number 7, there's not much of the hard work going on of trying to cultivate people, like wean them from having out-of-season food all the time, for example. So in that way, it's not moving us very far along. Now, if you think that building a local food system is important for a post-consumerist society, then you're going to think this is positive. If you want them to be changing the drivers of economic and social capitalism, it's not the answer. Okay, so just one more little bit here in terms of supporting emergence at the grassroots. So 2 remarks. There are lots of remarks that could come out of this exercise of trying to assess the significance, but I wanted to mention 2 really briefly. First, it would be a mistake to use these criteria as a tool of judgment and dismissal. That is not in the spirit of a politics of possibility. What this tool should be used for is for learning and reflection. And it made me, for example, think about why did this movement develop the way it did in North Carolina. And I think that it reflects the kind of neoliberal terrain on which this movement developed. And we can talk about that later. I think social media made a big difference. This neoliberal terrain idea, there's a term that someone used called perverse confluence for the neoliberal terrain. We can talk about that later if you want. But anyway, doing this caused me to reflect more on what was going on here. And no matter what the cause of it is, the groups, the national groups and regional groups that could build on this kind of mass of sentiment and effort that's out there needs to understand these organizational changes that have gone on. And finally, a related point is that I very much doubt that these complex cultural assemblages and communities of practice that have emerged, I doubt that one of them is going to be the magic bullet which will take us the whole way to a post-consumerist society. One thing about our study, these areas that we were studying, the 4 different areas have very different histories, social relations, and they're just, one thing is not going to fit everything. So I didn't get around to talking about the supporting aspects and ideas for that, but I do have slides and we can talk about that. So I'll stop.